Nepal is a sliver on the map of Asia, 800 kilometres long, in places less than 150 wide. Inside that sliver, the ground climbs from 60 metres above sea level to 8,849. The lowest 17% of that country is flat. It is warm. The soil is deep river silt, laid down over thousands of years. By every measure a farmer would use, it is the best land in Nepal. For most of recorded history, almost nobody lived there. They lived on the slopes above it. 65% of Nepal is hill country, steep, thin-soiled, cut by gorges, stripped by landslides every monsoon. Nearly half the population farmed it anyway. They cut the hillsides into stairs to do it. And some went further. Above the hills, past the last trees, in valleys where rain almost never falls, there are villages. Not camps, not summer shelters. Stone houses, monasteries, barley fields. At 3,800 metres, at 4,000, higher, 2 miles above the sea, year-round. Both things are true at once. The best ground in the country stood nearly empty. The hardest ground held people who never left. None of that is an accident. So what was wrong with the bottom? 2 miles is 3,219 metres. It is a number worth holding on to because the body notices it. At sea level, air pressure is what your lungs were built for. At 2 miles up, it is about 2/3 of that. Every breath you take is the same size. It simply carries less. Climb to 4,000 metres and the figure falls to around 60%. At 5,500, you are breathing half the oxygen you were born to. The body responds badly at first. The heart rate climbs, sleep breaks into fragments, appetite disappears. In the worst cases, fluid collects in the lungs or around the brain, and a healthy adult can die in a day. That is what altitude does to a visitor. Now hold that against a map of Nepal. There are roughly 1,282 permanent settlements in this country above 3,000 metres. Most of them sit in the band between 3,000 and 3,500. But the count does not stop there. It thins, and it keeps going. Do Terai, in the far northwest, sits at just over 4,000 metres. People are born there, people grow old there, and they are not the highest residents on this land. In 1924, a naturalist on the British Everest expedition found something at 6,700 metres that should not have been there. Spiders. Small ones, dark, no larger than a grain of rice, living under stones frozen to the mountain. Nobody believed him. There is nothing to eat at that height. The last plant stopped growing more than a kilometre below it. The assumption was simple. The wind had blown them up there, and they were dying. 30 years later, an American biologist named Lawrence Swan went up Makalu to check. He found them again, alive, hunting. Females about 5 millimetres long, males smaller still, waiting under rock debris. And he worked out what they were eating. The wind that everyone assumed had stranded them was in fact feeding them. Every day, air rising off the valleys below carries a fine drift of organic matter up the mountain. Pollen, plant fragments, insects too small to see. Springtails live on the debris, flies live on the fungi that rot it, and the spider lives on both. An entire food chain, running on what the wind delivers. Nothing on that mountain grows, everything on that mountain arrives. The species was formally described in 1975 and given a name that translates roughly as standing above everything. Euophrys omnisuperstes. It is worth sitting with because it is the same problem the people of this country face, written small. There is no food where the air is thin. There is no soil worth the name. What exists at height exists because something carried it there, or because something learned to live on very little. To understand why anyone in Nepal lives 2 miles up, you have to start with why the mountains are here at all. Around 50 million years ago, the Indian plate collided with Eurasia. It has not stopped. India is still driving north at roughly 4 to 5 centimetres a year. Most of that motion is absorbed elsewhere. but somewhere between 15 and 21 millimeters of it every year is taken up along a single vast fault that runs the length of the range. Geologists call it the main Himalayan thrust. It dips gently northward from about 10 kilometers deep at the southern foothills to more than 30 beneath Tibet. India is not going around the obstacle, it is going underneath it, and the crust above is being crumpled upward. The Greater Himalaya is rising by something on the order of 4 to 6 millimeters a year. It sounds like nothing. Over 1 million years, it is 4 to 6 kilometers of mountain. That is the first thing the land decided. Everything else follows from it. Because a wall that high does something to the sky. Each summer, the landmass of Asia heats faster than the Indian Ocean beside it. Air rises over the continent. Wet air is pulled off the sea to replace it, and it comes north in a front 1,800 kilometers wide, saturated with water. Then it hits Nepal. The air has nowhere to go but up. Rising, it cools. Cooling, it can no longer hold what it is carrying, and it lets go. The southern slopes of these mountains are among the wettest inhabited places on the planet. At Lumla, on the flank of the Annapurnas, the rain gauge collects something in the order of 5,500 millimeters in a year. 80 kilometers north of that gauge, on the other side of the same mountains, sits a walled town where the annual rainfall is around 200 millimeters. Same country, same summer, same storm. One wall between them. That is what a mountain range is in the end. Not scenery, a machine for sorting water. And the water that falls on the southern slopes has to go somewhere. It goes south in a hurry. Nepal is drained by 4 great systems. The Koshi in the east, the Gandaki through the centre, the Karnali in the west, and the Mahakali on the border. Between them, they gather dozens of Himalayan tributaries, cut south through the ranges in gorges, and spill out onto the plains. There, the gradient collapses. The rivers slow, and everything they were carrying, silt, sand, ground up mountain, drops out of the water and settles. The result is a fan of sediment at the foot of the range, some of them covering more than 10,000 square kilometers each. Layer on layer of pulverized Himalaya spread flat. That is the Terai, Nepal's lowland. The best farmland in the country, and it exists only because the mountains are being destroyed upstream. 17% of the land area, elevation between 60 and about 300 meters. Warm all year, watered every summer, soil meters deep. And for centuries, it was the one part of Nepal that could kill you for sleeping in it. The same heat and standing water that made the Terai fertile made it perfect for the Anopheles mosquito. Malaria was endemic across the belt. It was not a seasonal inconvenience, it was a working assumption. To spend a night in the low country was understood, by people in the hills, as a decision to gamble. So the plains stayed forest. Sal woodland and tall grass, tigers, rhinoceros, wild elephant. A frontier the state at times found useful precisely because nobody could cross it easily. The exception was the Tharu. They had lived in the Terai for centuries and carried a degree of resistance to the disease that the hill populations did not. The forest that kept everyone else out was not a barrier to them. It was home and it was protection. That is the answer to the question in the opening. There was nothing wrong with the bottom, agriculturally. The soil was the finest in the country. It was simply lethal. And so the population of Nepal did what the terrain instructed. It went up. Not for the view, for the altitude at which mosquitoes cannot breed. 1954. Sprayers move into the Rapti Valley. The program is a joint effort between the government and an American aid mission, and the chemical is DDT. It is applied to house walls, to villages, to the margins of the forest. Within a few years, transmission collapses. By the early 1960s, malaria in the Terai is close to gone, and the map of Nepal begins to redraw itself. People came down from the hills, not slowly. Land was cleared, granted, resettled. A highway was pushed east to west along the foot of the mountains, and the plains that had held almost nobody became the most populated region in the country. Today, somewhere near half of all Nepalese live in the Terai. In the space of 2 generations, the emptiest ground became the fullest. The forest paid for it first. Sal woodland that had covered the belt was cut for timber and cleared for fields, and much of it is simply gone. The Tharu paid for it next. The disease that had isolated them had also protected their claim to the land. When it was removed, hill migrants arrived with capital, literacy in the language of the courts, and an understanding of new land registration rules the Tharu did not have. Much of the ground their families had worked for generations was registered by other people. Some of them ended up labouring on it. The malaria was a genuine cure. It saved lives at a scale that is hard to argue with. It also dissolved the only wall a people had. North of the plains, the ground stands up. First, the Sawaliks, low, crumbling foothills of compressed river gravel, the youngest rock in the country and the weakest. Then the Mahabharat range behind them, harder and higher, running the full length of Nepal like a second wall. Between the two, in a handful of places, the ground opens into long, flat-bottomed valleys. Chitwan, Dang, Dukuri. The inner plains, warm and fertile, hidden behind the first ridge. And then, beyond the Mahabharat, the hill country, the Pahad. 65% of Nepal's land area. Ridges and side ridges and river valleys folded into each other, from 600 metres up to 3,000. No horizon anywhere, nothing flat. Around 45% of the country lives here, which raises an obvious problem. You cannot grow rice on a slope. Water runs off it. Soil runs off with the water. So the people of the hills did the only thing the terrain permitted. They stopped the slope from being a slope. A hill terrace is a simple idea executed at an almost unreasonable scale. You cut into the hillside. You take the material you removed and build it outward as a lip. What you are left with is a shelf, level, bounded, able to hold standing water. Then you do it again below, and again, and again, until the whole hillside is a staircase. Some of these systems climb 600 vertical metres. They were built with hand tools, maintained by hand, and repaired by hand every year after the rain. And they need water. Not rain, controlled water. So the hills are threaded with irrigation channels, some of them kilometres long, contoured around ridges at a fall gentle enough to keep the flow moving without cutting into its own bed. Locally, these are kulos. Many are older than the households that maintain them, and the rules for sharing what runs through them are older still. It is one of the largest earthworks on the planet, and it was never designed. It accumulated. And because the hills are vertical, a farm here is not a place. It is a column. Elevation changes the crop every few hundred metres. Low on the slope, below about 2,000, the terraces are wet and flooded and grow rice. Higher, where the water will not sit and the frosts come earlier, they run dry and grow maize and millet. Higher still, past 2,500, the list narrows to wheat, barley, buckwheat and potato, and the number of frost nights climbs past 150 a year. A single household will often work land in 2 or 3 of those bands at once, walking an hour uphill between fields, harvesting different crops in different months from ground that is technically the same farm. They are not diversifying by choice. The mountain gave them a farm standing on its end, so they planted it in layers. The land takes it back constantly. These mountains are young, which means the rock is broken and the slopes are steeper than the material can support. Add 1,500 millimeters of rain in 3 months and hillsides fail. Every monsoon, in every district, terraces slide. Fields go. Sometimes houses go with them. The terraces are not a victory over the slope. They are a rent, paid annually, on land that was never stable to begin with. In the 1950s, a Swiss geologist arrived to try to understand the whole of it. His name was Tony Hagen. Nepal had been effectively closed to outsiders for more than a century, and almost nothing about its interior had been systematically recorded. There were no roads to speak of. There were no reliable maps of the north. So, he walked. Over the following years, Hagen covered an estimated 14,000 kilometres on foot, moving through valleys where nobody had ever arrived with a hammer and a notebook. He crossed the passes. He sat in villages. He wrote down the rock. What he produced was the first coherent geological picture of the country, and a division of Nepal into 8 physiographic units, running south to north, that specialists still respect. He also kept returning to one question, and it is the same question this documentary is asking. Not what is up there, why are there people up there? Before we follow him north, there is one valley we have to stop in, because it is the exception that proves how strict the rules are. At 1,400 meters, roughly halfway between the plains and the high peaks, the hill country does something it does almost nowhere else. It goes flat. The Kathmandu Valley is about 30 kilometers east to west and 25 north to south, ringed by hills on every side, and its floor is close to level. In a country made entirely of gradient, there is a bowl of open ground the size of a small city. It holds the densest population in Nepal. It always has. And the reason it is flat is that it used to be underwater. For most of the last 2 million years, the Kathmandu Valley was a lake. It formed the way most things here form, by tectonics. The southern rim of the basin rose faster than the river draining it could cut down, and the water backed up behind the ridge. The basin filled. At its greatest extent, the surface stood somewhere between 1,400 and 1,440 meters, deep enough in places to drown a 20-story building, and it covered nearly the entire valley floor. For 1 million years and more, that lake sat there collecting sediment. Fine silt washed off the surrounding hills. Organic matter sank and, in the low-oxygen mud of the lake bed, did not rot. Layer on layer of black organic clay accumulated, hundreds of meters thick. Geologists call it the Kalimati. Fossils pulled out of these sediments include the remains of animals that no longer exist here at all, ancient relatives of elephants, hippopotamus-like creatures, crocodilians. This valley was a warm, shallow, crowded lake. And then the water left. Not all at once. The drainage appears to have happened in stages, over tens of thousands of years, as the outlet cut down and as earthquakes shook the basin. Sediment records point to major lowerings around 50,000 years ago, and again around 38,000. Local tradition tells it differently, and more directly. A bodhisattva named Manjushri came to the lake, saw the light of a lotus burning on its surface, and cut the ridge open with his sword to let the water out, so that people could live where the water had been. The geology and the story agree on the outcome. The lake drained. What it left behind was a floor of exceptional soil, level, well-watered, ringed by defensible hills, and at exactly the right height. 1,400 meters is the number that matters. High enough that malaria was never a serious constraint. Low enough that rice, the crop this region is organized around, ripens without difficulty. Warm summers, mild winters, no killing frost in the fields. Add to that a second accident of position. The valley sits directly on the shortest practical route between the Gangetic Plain and the Tibetan Plateau. Everything moving between India and Tibet had reason to pass through it. Fertile floor, safe elevation, a trade route running through the front door. Cities rose here, and they were rich enough to spend centuries carving wood. The lake left one other thing, and it is not a gift. Several hundred meters of soft clay and loose sediment sitting in a closed bowl behind hard rock is close to the worst possible ground to build a city on in an active mountain range. Soft basin fill amplifies seismic waves. It shakes longer and harder than bedrock does, and saturated sand within it can lose strength entirely when shaken. The same deposit that made the valley worth settling is the reason the valley shakes the way it does. So the flattest ground in the hills is a drowned lake bed, and the price of its soil is written into the ground beneath it. That is the pattern this country runs on. There is no free land anywhere in Nepal. There is only land where the terms are survivable. And above the valley, the terms get harder. Beyond 3,000 meters, the forest thins and then gives up. Rhododendron and birch give way to juniper scrub, then to grass, then to rock. The growing season shortens to a few months. Frost arrives on more than 200 nights a year. At that height, human beings stop being able to farm their way to a living. There is not enough sun, not enough soil, not enough time. So the people who live there did not solve the problem with agriculture, they solved it with an animal. The yak is not a cow that got used to the cold. It is a separate species, shaped by this exact terrain. Its lungs and heart are large for its body. Its blood carries less hemoglobin than lowland cattle, not more. The same counterintuitive answer the human Highlanders arrived at. Its coat is a double layer, a dense undercoat beneath a long outer skirt that hangs almost to the ground and sheds snow off the flanks. It has few functional sweat glands, and it does not need them. What it does is convert the one resource high Nepal has in quantity, thin alpine grass on ground too steep and too cold for anything else, into everything a household needs. Milk and butter that keeps for months without refrigeration in a place with no refrigeration. Meat. Wool for rope and tent cloth. Hide for boots. Dung, dried in cakes on stone walls, which above the tree line is not waste, but the only fuel there is. And carriage. Loaded, a yak will move freight across a 5,000-meter pass that no wheeled vehicle can reach. The trade runs one way only. Bring a yak down to the lowlands, and it suffers. Heat it cannot shed, air too rich, disease it has no defense against. The animal that makes the heights livable cannot itself come down. It is a straightforward bargain, and everybody at altitude has taken it. The land will not feed you directly. It will feed an animal, and the animal will feed you. Every high village in this country is, underneath, a herd with houses attached. 200 kilometers west of Kathmandu, the hills open a second time, and this one is stranger. Pokhara sits at around 800 meters on a broad, flat floor beside a lake. 30 kilometers to the north, the Annapurna Wall rises past 8,000. There is almost nothing in between. No gradual foothills, no long approach. The plain ends and the range starts. It is one of the sharpest changes in elevation over a short horizontal distance anywhere on the planet, from the valley floor to the summits, more than 7,000 meters in about 30 kilometers. That geometry has a direct consequence. Air moving north off the plains has no slow ramp to climb. It is forced up almost vertically, and it dumps everything it has immediately. Pokhara takes around 3,400 millimeters of rain a year. On the ridge above it, Lumle collects roughly 5,500. It is the wettest inhabited ground in the country by a wide margin. And the flat floor those buildings stand on is not old, and it is not ordinary soil. The valley is filled with tens of meters of coarse debris, gravel, boulders, ground-up limestone that came down off the Annapurna Massif in a small number of catastrophic events, geologically recent, and spread across the basin. The Seti River runs through the middle of it. In places, it has cut a slot into that fill so narrow you can stand at the edge of the city and not see the water, only hear it, somewhere below your feet. So the second largest settlement in Nepal is built on a pile of shattered mountain, delivered by the mountain, in a place that catches more rain than almost anywhere people live. The same collision that raises the peaks manufactures the flat land at their base. It just delivers it all at once. There is one more thing this terrain provides, and without it, none of the rest would function. Nepal's monsoon delivers most of the year's water in 3 or 4 months. The rest of the year is dry. In a country of steep ground and no storage, that should mean rivers that run hard in August and vanish in April, and a population that starves in the gap. It does not happen, and the mountains are the reason. The high Himalaya holds an enormous volume of water in the only form that survives a dry season: snow and ice. Through the hot, rainless spring, that storm melts. The great rivers keep flowing through the months when nothing is falling out of the sky, fed from above rather than from the clouds. Which is why the trans-Himalayan valleys can farm at all. Manang, Mustang and Dolpo do not grow barley on rainfall. 200 millimeters a year will not raise a crop. They grow it on channels dug from glacier-fed streams, threading meltwater across terraces the rain never reaches. In the driest part of the country, the water arrives as ice on a delay of several months, released by heat rather than weather. The wall that blocks the rain is also the tank that stores it. There is something wrong with the rivers of Nepal, and once you notice it, you cannot stop noticing it. Water is supposed to run downhill and around obstacles. The rivers here do not. The Arun rises about 150 kilometers inside Tibet, on the far side of the highest mountains on the planet. Rather than draining north into the plateau, or east or west, it turns south and cuts straight through the Himalaya. Through it, not around. The Karnali does the same. So does the Sunkoshi. So, most famously, does the Gandaki. The explanation is uncomfortable to hold in your head. These rivers are older than the mountains they pass through. Before the range existed, the drainage was already established, running south off a much lower landscape toward the sea. Then the collision began, and the ground started to rise beneath the water. A river that cannot cut fast enough gets dammed, ponds up, and finds a new way around. That happened in places. The Kathmandu Basin is a lakebed for exactly that reason. But where the water carried enough force, it simply cut down as fast as the rock came up. Millimetre for millimetre, century after century. The mountain rose. The river held its line. Geologists call it antecedent drainage. In plain terms, the river refused to move, so the mountains grew around it. Remember that, because it is going to matter more than anything else in this documentary. It also produced the passages that make the north habitable at all. A river cutting through a rising range does not leave a valley. It leaves a slot, a deep, narrow corridor running from the plains to the plateau, crossing a wall that is otherwise impassable for hundreds of kilometers at a stretch. Every one of Nepal's northern communities sits on or near one of them. The best known lies in the east, above the Dud Koshi. Namche Bazaar sits at 3,440 meters in a natural amphitheatre of terraced ground, facing south, catching what sun the season provides. It is there for the same reason everything up here is there. Behind it, at 5,800 meters, lies the Nangpa La, a glaciated pass over the main range into Tibet, and for centuries, one of the most heavily used crossings in the eastern Himalaya. The Sherpa arrived in this valley from eastern Tibet roughly 500 years ago. The name itself carries the direction of travel, people of the east. They came over that pass, and they settled where a south-facing bowl of workable ground sat within reach of it. Namche did not become a market town because it is beautiful. It became a market town because it is the last flat ground before the pass and the first after it. Tibetan salt and wool came down, Nepali grain and iron went up, and a village at 3,500 meters took its cut of both. 3,400 meters is comfortably more than 2 miles. The air there delivers around 65% of the oxygen at sea level. Visitors who fly in and walk up too quickly get headaches, nausea, and sometimes worse. Roughly a quarter of people who ascend rapidly to this kind of altitude feel it. The people who live there do not. For a long time, the assumption was that they had simply grown used to it. That turned out to be wrong in an interesting way. When a lowlander goes high, the body's response is to make more red blood cells. The kidneys sense low oxygen, release the hormone erythropoietin, and the blood thickens with oxygen carriers. It is an obvious solution and it works, up to a point. Past that point, it becomes the problem.
Thickened blood is harder to push. Pressure rises in the lungs' arteries, the heart strains. Populations that live permanently at altitude on this strategy pay for it in chronic mountain sickness, headaches, exhaustion, cardiac failure. The Tibetan-descended peoples of the Himalaya do not use that strategy. Their hemoglobin stays low, measurably lower than a lowlander's at the same height, and sometimes barely above sea level values. The genetics behind that center on 2 genes in the oxygen sensing pathway, EPAS1 and EGLN1. Both show unusually strong signatures of selection in Tibetan populations. The variant of EPAS1 they carry blunts the erythropoietin response. It turns down the instruction to thicken the blood. And the version they carry appears to have entered the human line from an archaic population, the Denisovans, tens of thousands of years ago. It was already in the gene pool. Altitude simply made it valuable. Instead of more carriers, the adaptation improves delivery. Highlanders exhale far more nitric oxide than lowlanders do, a signal that widens blood vessels. Blood flow through the limbs runs higher. More oxygen reaches the tissue per unit of blood, rather than more blood being manufactured to carry it. In one study, serum erythropoietin in Sherpas living at 3,440 meters came out equal to that of non-Sherpas at 1,300. Their bodies were, in effect, not registering the altitude as an emergency. Deeper in, the muscle is different too. Sherpa skeletal muscle shows a lower capacity to burn fat and a shift toward fuels that yield more energy per unit of oxygen consumed. It is a metabolic economy, tuned for a place where oxygen is the scarce input. It took roughly 500 years in Khumbu and thousands on the plateau before that to arrive at it. That is not a long time in evolutionary terms. It is what happens when the pressure is severe and constant and every generation is tested by it. And it is worth being precise about what that means, because it is easy to romanticize. The adaptation is not immunity. Above about 5,500 meters, no human population lives permanently. Not Sherpa, not Tibetan, nobody. Beyond that height, the body loses ground faster than it can recover, and the mountains stop negotiating. Nepal's high settlements are not proof that people can live anywhere. They are proof of exactly where the line is. Below that line, the same country holds an animal that has drawn its own. The snow leopard is almost never seen. Herders in Dolpo and Mustang and Manang can go years without a sighting and know perfectly well the animal is there, because the losses tell them. It is built for broken, dry, high ground. The tail is nearly as long as the body, a counterweight for turns on unstable rock, and a wrap for the face while sleeping. The paws are wide and fur-covered, spreading weight on snow and insulating on stone. The nasal cavity is enlarged, warming and moistening cold, thin air before it reaches the lungs. The coat is smoke grey and rosetted, which on grass would be conspicuous, and on scree is close to invisible. It hunts blue sheep almost exclusively, Baral, the stocky grey-blue wild sheep that graze the same alpine slopes the herders use. Where the Baral are, the leopard is. And where the Baral are is decided by the rain shadow, by the grass line, by the slope angle. Predator, prey, and herder all read the same map, drawn by the same terrain. None of them chose it. Which brings us to the strangest part of the country. Manang sits at roughly 3,500 meters in a valley behind the Annapurna Massif. Look south from the village and you are looking at some of the wettest terrain on the planet. Look at the ground under your feet and you are standing in a desert. The monsoon cannot get over the mountain. What little air does make it across has already dropped its water on the southern face. Manang farms with meltwater channeled off glaciers on ground where the annual rainfall would embarrass a Mediterranean coast. The word usually reached for here is remote. It is worth pausing on that word because it is doing more damage than it looks. Remote from what? From Kathmandu, certainly, a hard walk over a high pass. But these valleys never faced Kathmandu, they faced north. For most of their history, the trans-Himalayan valleys of Nepal were better connected to Tibet than to their own lowlands. The plateau was a few days away over ground they knew. The plains were weeks away through malarial forest. Manang's traders were granted privileges to travel and trade abroad, and they used them across Asia. These places are not isolated, they were the crossings. It is only when you draw the map with a modern border across the top and a capital city in the middle that they look like the end of the road. Go further west and the ground gets harder still. Dolpo, behind the main range, is the largest and emptiest district in the country. Its villages sit in the rain shadow on a high, dry, broken plateau, Ringmo at 3,660 metres beside a lake dammed by ancient rockfall, Saldang at around 3,770 and Do Tarap at just over 4,000. 4,000 metres is close to the ceiling. At that height, the frost-free window is a matter of weeks. The list of crops that will finish in time is not long. Barley, buckwheat, potatoes, and not much else. Wheat is marginal. Rice is a memory of somewhere else. And yet, Do Tarap is not a shepherd's camp. It has stone houses with carved window frames, monasteries with wall paintings, mani walls, permanent fields. The contradiction is worth stating plainly. This is agricultural land that barely qualifies as agricultural land, occupied permanently by people who built for centuries rather than seasons. Nobody does that for a marginal barley crop. They did it because of what came through. The same pattern repeats along the whole northern edge, wherever a valley reaches the border. Humla, in the far northwest, whose main settlement at Simikot had no road connection to the rest of the country for most of its history and traded north instead. Jumla, in the Karnali Basin, where rice is grown at around 2,300 metres, close to the highest paddy in the world. Rara, the largest lake in Nepal, sitting near 3,000 metres in one of its emptiest districts. Tengboche in the Khumbu, a monastery placed on a ridge saddle at 3,867 metres on the only sensible resting point on the way to the pass. Different valleys, different peoples, the same sighting logic applied independently over and over. Around the year 1400, on the trail beneath the Thorong Pass, a caravan is moving south. The animals are carrying salt. It has come from the dry lakes of the Tibetan Plateau, scraped and hauled and traded down through the high valleys. At the villages below the pass, it will be exchanged for grain grown in the Nepali hills, and the grain will go back north because the plateau cannot grow enough of it. Salt down, grain up. Both directions across a 5,000-meter pass, twice a year, for centuries. At the foot of that pass stands Muktinath at 3,760 meters. Water flows from 108 stone spouts. Natural gas seeps from the rock and burns at the base of a spring, a small blue flame beside running water. It is one of the most sacred sites in the Himalaya, holy to Hindus and to Buddhists, and pilgrims have come to it for well over 1,000 years. Look at where it is. Not on a plain, not in a capital. At the top of the hardest crossing on the route, where anyone who had made it that far had reason to give thanks, and anyone about to attempt it had reason to ask for help. The sacred geography of these mountains sits exactly on top of the economic geography. The land chose the sites. People consecrated what the land had already made unavoidable. And twice a year, something crosses this wall without using the passes at all. The bar-headed goose migrates between wintering grounds on the Indian subcontinent and breeding lakes on the Tibetan plateau. That route puts the Himalaya directly across its path. It goes over. Its hemoglobin differs from that of related geese by a very small number of amino acid substitutions, and the effect is to bind oxygen more readily at low pressure. Its lungs are proportionally larger. Its flight muscle is denser in capillaries and mitochondria, packed closer to the fuel supply. Its heart can drive far more blood, far faster, on far less oxygen. Tracking has shown these birds mostly hug the terrain rather
than climbing to the summits. They follow the valleys and the passes, taking the lowest line the range allows, and they climb hardest at night when the air is cooler and denser. Even the animal built specifically for crossing this wall looks for the gap, which is the last thing to understand about Nepal. Everything that lives here, the spider on the wind, the yak on the grass, the leopard on the scree, the goose in the dark, the trader with the salt, is solving the same problem. Where is the way through? There is one gap in this wall that is deeper, older, and more consequential than all the others. It runs between two mountains over 8,000 meters high, and it was cut by a river that was already there before either of them existed. Annapurna 1 rises to 8,091 meters, Dhaulagiri 1 to 8,167. They stand roughly 35 kilometers apart, facing each other across a valley. The floor of that valley, between them, lies at around 2,500 meters. Set those numbers side by side and the scale becomes difficult to picture. From the riverbed to the summits above, it is more than 5.5 vertical kilometers on both sides within a day's walk. By vertical relief, it is the deepest gorge on Earth. The river running through the bottom of it is the Kali Gandaki, and it did not find this gap, it made it. Before the Himalaya existed, this drainage was already flowing south off a low landscape toward the sea. Then India arrived, and the ground began to lift. The river did not divert. Season after season, it ground down through whatever rose beneath it, at almost exactly the rate the rock was pushed up. The mountains grew, the water kept its line. What opened between them was not a valley carved into a mountain range. It was a mountain range that grew around a river and could not close over it. The proof is lying loose in the riverbed, and pilgrims have been collecting it for centuries. They are called shaligram, black stones that split open to reveal a tight spiral inside. They are ammonites, marine mollusks extinct for 66 million years that lived on the floor of a sea. That sea was the Tethys, and it lay between India and Asia before the collision closed it. Its bed was scraped up, folded, and lifted into the sky. The summits of these mountains contain rock that formed underwater. The river cutting down through the range is exposing the old seafloor and washing it out into the gravel. Which is why, 3,000 meters above sea level, in the driest country in Nepal, you can pick up a seashell. To Hindus, shaligram are held to be manifestations of Vishnu himself, and the Kali Gandaki is the only place on earth they are found. Pilgrims have walked this gorge to collect them for well over 1,000 years. They are pilgrimaging along a fault in the roof of the world, gathering fossils from a vanished ocean, and they were doing it long before anyone drew the cross-section that explains it. Now walk north up that corridor and watch what happens to the country. At Tatapani, near the bottom, the valley is subtropical. Bananas, terraced rice, rain that arrives most summer afternoons. Climb. The rice gives out. Pine and juniper take over. Around Kagbeni, at 2,800 meters, the last of the green stops as if it has been cut with a blade. Beyond it, the ground is grey, ochre and red. Eroded cliffs, canyon walls, dust and open sky. Rainfall drops to around 200 millimeters a year, less than Cairo receives. You have not left the wettest country in the Himalaya. You have simply walked to the other side of its wall. And every afternoon, without fail, the wind arrives. It is a direct consequence of the shape of the ground. The dry plateau to the north heats hard through the morning. Hot air over the plateau rises. Something has to replace it, and the only large opening between the plateau and the humid air to the south is this gorge. So the corridor becomes a chimney. By late morning, the wind begins to move up the valley. By early afternoon, it is a gale, routinely over 40 kilometers an hour, loaded with sand off the riverbed. It happens nearly every day. Local life is arranged around it. Flights into Jomsom go in the morning or not at all. Walking north is done at first.
Light. Fields are walled. Roofs are weighted with stone. A wind on a schedule. Not weather. Architecture. And at the top of the corridor, at 3,840 meters, there is a walled town. Lo Mantang was established around 1380. Perhaps 150 households sit behind a rampart of mud brick in a grid of narrow lanes beneath a palace begun in the 15th century and 4 monasteries whose murals are counted among the finest Tibetan Buddhist paintings surviving anywhere. It is 2 miles above the sea, in a cold desert, on ground that will ripen barley and buckwheat and very little else. Ask why it is there, and the answer is not spiritual, and it is not stubbornness. It is there because it stands on the door. This is the payoff for everything we have been building. The Himalaya is a continuous wall for hundreds of kilometers, and a wall like that has almost no gates. But the antecedent rivers, the ones that were flowing before the mountains rose, cut a handful of slots straight through it and kept them open. The Kali Gandaki is the deepest and the most usable. For centuries it carried the single most important trade in the region. Salt from the plateau moving south, grain from the hills moving north, along with wool, turquoise, borax, and animals. That trade did not pass through empty country. It required people stationed on the route to feed the caravans, to breed and rest the pack animals, to hold the ground, to tax what moved. Whoever sat at the top of the gorge controlled the crossing. So a kingdom grew where nothing should support a kingdom. Low-built walls, monasteries and a palace on 200 millimeters of rain a year, because the corridor beneath it was worth more than the soil around it. And the same wall that starves the fields is what makes the place work. The rain shadow means no monsoon deluge. No monsoon deluge means no landslides tearing out the trail every summer, and it means the route stays open when everything to the south turns to mud. The dry cold preserves grain and preserves buildings. The reason those murals survived at all is that nothing here is ever damp. Look at the cliffs around the town, and you can see how far that logic was pushed. Thousands of chambers are cut into the vertical rock faces of this valley. Man-made caves, some in stacks 8 and 9 levels high, dug into cliffs that would collapse anywhere with real rainfall. Everything the terrain took away here, it also gave back in a different currency. The aridity that made farming marginal made the corridor reliable. The wall that blocked the rain sheltered the route. The river that made the gorge unlivable in vertical terms made it the only passage in horizontal ones. So, why does anyone live 2 miles above the sea? Not for the view. Not because their ancestors were driven up there and never came down. Because at the bottom of this country, the finest land in it was lethal, and the mosquito held it for centuries. Because in the middle, the ground stands on its edge, and every field is a staircase held up by hand against a monsoon that pulls it apart every year. And because at the top, in the one place where the mountains were forced to leave a gap, there was a corridor between 2 civilizations. And a corridor is worth living on, whatever it costs to breathe. The land ran the arithmetic first. Every village in Nepal is sitting inside the answer. Tony Hagen spent years walking this country to understand its structure, and what he was really mapping was that logic, where the rock allows people and where it does not, and why. He found no ground here that was simply good. He found ground where the terms were survivable, and he found people who had read those terms with extraordinary precision, generation by generation, without ever writing them down. But the terms are not fixed, and this is the part that unsettles. The collision is not over. India is still driving north at 4 to 5 centimeters a year. 15 to 21 millimeters of that is still being taken up along the great thrust beneath these mountains. The high Himalaya is still rising by something like 4 to 6 millimeters a year. The strain does not release smoothly. It accumulates on a locked fault for centuries and then moves at once. That is what an earthquake in this country is.
The mountains completing a movement they have been holding, and the rivers are still cutting at almost exactly the same rate. The Gandaki is still deepening its gorge. The Arun is still slicing south through the highest ground on the planet. Everything we have described is a photograph of a process that is running right now at a speed no human lifetime can register. The wall is being built and drilled through simultaneously. It always has been. High above the last fields, when the snow finally goes, the slopes fill with a sound like a whistle. The Himalayan marmot lives in colonies on alpine grassland up to around 5,000 meters, in burrow systems dug meters into ground that spends most of the year frozen. Through the short summer, it does almost nothing but eat, laying on fat until it is nearly spherical. Then, as the cold returns, the colony goes underground together, seals the entrances from the inside, and sleeps. 6 months, sometimes 7 or 8, body temperature falls close to the temperature of the burrow, the heart slows to a fraction of its waking rate. It does not outcompete the winter, it does not outwork it, it simply absents itself for 2/3 of the year and takes the window the land is prepared to offer. Of everything living at this altitude, the marmot may be the most honest about the arrangement. There is a particular way people talk about mountains, as things to be conquered or as backdrops for someone's endurance. Nepal makes both of those sound faintly ridiculous. Nothing here was conquered. The mosquito decided where the first millennium of settlement could not go. The slope decided the shape of every field in the hills. The lake decided where the cities would be. The oxygen decided the ceiling. And one stubborn river, older than the range around it, decided where the door would be, and therefore who would grow rich standing next to it. Perhaps what matters is not that people found a way to live 2 miles above the sea. It is that the land had already written down what it would allow, and somebody, without instruments, without maps, without any of this understood, read it correctly and stayed. Thanks for watching. Until the next journey.